Hey everyone. Tonight we're diving into the incredible lives and sheer resilience of medieval peasants. These were the everyday heroes who, against all odds, survived some of the coldest, most brutal nights history has ever seen. We'll be looking at everything from their clever insulation hacks to the ways they slept together just to stay warm. It's really a story of grit, ingenuity, and pure determination. So before you get too settled in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're actually vibing with what I'm doing here. Also drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I honestly love seeing how far our little community reaches around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you probably picture knights jousting, grand feasts, or lively fairs. But for your average peasant, winter wasn't exactly merry. It was more like a nightly game of, how do we stay alive until morning? It wasn't just a season, it was a test of endurance. Like a cruel teacher who never gives second chances. Just imagine this, you're living in a tiny hut made of mud and sticks. The walls are so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze outside. No insulation, no real windows, just a small hole stuffed with animal skin, and definitely no thermostat wars with your siblings. The temperature inside your house was usually just a polite couple of degrees warmer than whatever was happening outside. So, if it was freezing outdoors, congratulations. It was slightly less freezing indoors. Nights were easily the worst part. The darkness just swallowed everything. You'd have the wind howling like an angry ghost, while the fire in the hearth sputtered along pathetically. It was doing its best, sure, but mostly it just roasted the toes of whoever happened to be sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camping outside, just with worse snacks. Clothing didn't really save you either. Peasants didn't have fancy fur coats or goose-down blankets. You basically had a couple of rough, scratchy wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously like a goat, and a prayer that layering them would turn you into a human onion. Spoiler alert, it didn't really work. And forget about snuggling under soft, fluffy quilts. Beds were usually nothing more than sacks stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with some old dried grass thrown in for good measure, and as a bonus, you had plenty of fleas to keep you company through the night. Talk about luxury, right? But seriously, the cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was straight up dangerous. Things like frostbite and hypothermia were constant threats, especially for the little ones and the elderly. Every single morning you woke up still breathing was a minor miracle. Honestly, it was worth celebrating. Maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yeah, surviving a medieval winter had zero to do with comfort. It was all about gritting your teeth, piling on every scrap of fabric you owned, huddling with your livestock, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And if you think your apartment is drafty because a window doesn't close right. Medieval peasants would like a word. Their homes weren't just drafty. They were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels that happened to have a roof. Most houses were made of what historians politely call wattle and daub. Translation, sticks woven together like a giant basket and smeared with a charming mix of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be gross, it was just a cheap, sticky insulator that was, shall we say, always readily available. But no matter how much love, or dung, you smeared on those walls, they didn't stand a chance against a real winter storm. The freezing wind would find every tiny crack and gap, gleefully dancing its way into your one-room home just to make sure you never got too cozy. Privacy? Forget it. Warmth? Not a chance. It was character building for sure. And don't even get me started on the roofs. Those thatched roofs might look picturesque in movies, but after a few months of rain and snow, They'd sag, leak, and occasionally drop the local wildlife right into your lap. Nothing ruins a relaxing evening like a squirrel falling into your dinner. Windows, if you even had them, were laughably tiny and usually just covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so ridiculously expensive that even the local lord probably only had one tiny pane. As for the peasants, they were just happy if a blizzard didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall. To make things worse, the floors were often just packed dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, mud would seep up from the ground. So, technically, they had indoor water features. Not that anyone was enjoying them. In the winter, every step inside your own home felt like trekking through a frozen marsh. Cold from below, cold from above, and cold from the sides, it was a full-on 3D assault on your body heat. But medieval peasants weren't the type to just sit there and whine. They'd pack every gap with moss, jam old rags into the draftiest spots, and huddle as close as humanly possible. It was human insulation at its finest. Honestly, a mix of creativity, stubbornness, and maybe some sheep grease rubbed into the walls was the only thing keeping them from becoming medieval popsicles. I mean, if your house is literally falling apart and your best defense is mud and goat hair, you kind of have to laugh about it, at least if your teeth aren't chattering too hard to try. And as if the freezing air wasn't enough, they had to fight a silent enemy rising from below, the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors back then. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth inside your hut. If you were lucky, maybe someone threw down some straw to give you the illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you were only one thin, scratchy layer away from the cold, hard dirt. And man, that cold was relentless. The cold seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw, into your bones and straight into your very soul. Seriously, if you dropped something on the floor during a winter night, congratulations! It was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in a few ways. One method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor, if you could afford it. Or, let's be real, if you could borrow enough from your neighbor's field without getting caught. But straw flattened out fast, got moldy even faster, and added a loud, crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable night. Some homes used dried rushes instead. Every so often, they'd just throw fresh ones on top without cleaning out the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet padding, if your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and smelled like a wet dog. Beds didn't really solve much either. They were usually just wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of a cozy mattress, you had these poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did almost nothing against the cold radiating from below. Tossing and turning wasn't about finding a sweet spot for comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep your blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The truth is, they didn't exactly conquer the icy ground. They just learned to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was just about waking up with all your toes still attached. If you managed that, hey, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof or the walls. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that was the only real defense against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom. In most peasant homes, this was just a simple fire in the center of the room. No fancy stone mantels, no neat chimneys. Just a basic pit, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly turning into a ham. That's right. Most homes didn't even have chimneys. The smoke just did its best. The smoke just kind of drifted out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or, if it was feeling particularly lazy that evening, straight into your lungs. Obviously, it wasn't great for breathing or, your general lifespan. But on the bright side, it did a fantastic job of fumigating the fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs professional pest control when you're basically marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just there for warmth, though. It was your kitchen, your only light source, and honestly, the medieval version of a TV. People would sit around the fire, telling stories, sharing the latest gossip, or just staring into the flames. Mostly because, let's be real, there wasn't exactly much else to do after sunset. Keeping that fire alive wasn't just a nice-to-have idea. It was everything. It was absolutely mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like hanging up a welcome sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. And honestly, reigniting a fire in the middle of winter wasn't as simple as just striking a match. You had to struggle with flint, steel, kindling, and probably more prayers than you'd ever offered in your life. Every single person in the family had a job to do. Whether it was stoking the flames, watching the embers, or adding a bit of peat, some sticks, or, if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was this constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't exactly guarantee you'd survive, but without it, survival was basically impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, and often disappointing little fire, but in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting that fire go out overnight. Without that flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest season. And in the dead of winter, having to restart a fire from scratch wasn't just a massive pain, it could literally be deadly. Remember, matches didn't exist yet. Lighters, dream on. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that spark with more love and care than you'd give a newborn, using whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep, with fingers you can barely feel. Now, add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra motivation. So peasants got smart. They banked the fire. No, not in a cozy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, keeping the glowing coals alive, just barely, until morning. If you did it right, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile, add fresh wood, and voila! Fire without the frostbite. But if you messed it up, well, let's just say your morning was about to get a whole lot colder and grumpier. Fire banking was an art passed down like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their secrets. Dry ash only, or a little dampness, packing it tight versus letting it breathe. You could practically start a medieval brawl just by suggesting a different method. It was like arguing over modern barbecue techniques, but with much higher survival stakes. Sometimes, though, banking wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out, or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Yes, that actually happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night to check the coals. Basically the medieval version of sleepwalking to the thermostat. But if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was a victory. That was enough to face another day. In medieval times, the more the merrier wasn't about parties. It was a survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the wind whistled through the walls, there was one surefire source of warmth: each other. If that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, your neighbors, your livestock, and maybe a very confused goose, so be it. Personal space didn't exist. On the coldest nights, the goal was simple: don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households would pile into the warmest corner, forming what I can only describe as a desperate, snoring, human lasagna. Kids squeezed between parents, grandparents tucked under the outer layers, and if a random cousin showed up, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you slept in the middle where the body heat was peak. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to an open freezer door. And woe to the person who moved too much. One shift to get comfortable, and you've accidentally knocked Aunt Mildred into a freezing draft. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Since hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body heat was strategic. Some guides even recommended putting the strongest, warmest people on the outside like human shields, with babies and the elderly tucked deep in the center like precious little heat generators. Over time, this became part of family bonding. Long nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and some interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So next time your sibling steals the covers or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow room between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. And if you thought modern roommates were tough, medieval peasants had cows, goats, pigs, and chickens living right there with them. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky habit, it was vital. Livestock generated warmth, and in a hut where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every degree mattered. Plus, if your goat was sharing a wall with you, it was a lot harder for a neighbor to steal it in the night. 2 birds. 1 stinky stone. At night, the house basically became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens were nesting in the corners, pigs were snorting near the hearth, and cows were just lounging luxuriously against the walls, chewing their cud like they actually paid rent. It wasn't glamorous, not even close. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that, but it's a cow, it's winter, and there is literally nowhere else to go. The smell? Legendary. By springtime, the perfume of a shared winter was something else entirely. You didn't even need to light a candle, your nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed what you might call a selective nose. They didn't complain because they knew one uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals even had prime spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took center stage near the family. Goats were allowed close in for their warmth, and honestly, because goats being goats, they'd find a way inside anyway. Chickens roosted in the rafters or old baskets, and pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They just plopped down wherever they felt like it, usually right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock had its hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a great perch. Or worse, stepping barefoot into something suspicious first thing in the morning. Definitely not the best way to start your day. Yeah, medieval mornings were definitely full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math. Cold kills and cows cuddle, whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the only thing standing between you and the end. In a medieval winter, fashion wasn't about looking good. It was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends. They were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the grim reaper himself. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes all at once. First, you had the basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic. Then another one, if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders. And if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations! You're now officially 10% warmer and about 90% itchier. Boots were a total luxury back then. Most peasants just wrapped their feet in layers of old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still managed to bite through, well, you just added another rag and prayed you didn't lose a toe. And don't even think about washing all those layers. Doing laundry in the dead of winter meant dragging everything to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry. And that's if it didn't just freeze solid into a tragic shirticle first. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for, staying alive. Interestingly, All that dirt and grease buildup actually had a hidden bonus feature. It provided an extra layer of insulation. So being a little gross was technically a survival strategy. That grimy layer actually locked in your body heat. It was basically a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just way smellier and definitely not socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were like buried treasure. A simple woolen cap could be the only thing standing between you making it through the night, or waking up with your hair literally frozen to the wall. Gloves were usually homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scrounge up. Honestly, they probably looked more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. And the kids? They were swaddled so tightly they looked like overstuffed turnips waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap every single bit of body heat. Style and elegance? Never heard of them. In the Middle Ages, being warm was the ultimate flex. So next time you complain about putting on layers for a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags and feeling lucky to do it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't something you just scrubbed off. It was a survival tool. Getting grimy wasn't a sign that you'd given up on life. It was tactical. It was strategic. Dare I say, genius? See, winter had one main enemy, heat loss. Clean clothes, especially fresh linen, are surprisingly bad at keeping you warm. They're breathable, which is great for the gym. But when the temperature is hovering somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable is the last thing you want. That's where the dirt came in. As they went weeks without washing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud built up on their clothes. Over time, this created a kind of natural armor that clogged the gaps in the fabric, making it wind-resistant. It was medieval weatherproofing. Sure, you smelled like a goat that lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. Some people back then even believed that washing too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective layer of filth intact, right? Bathing was rare, laundry was rarer, and soap was saved for big events, like the bishop visiting or, your own funeral. To add to the strategy, you didn't change your clothes. You just kept adding layers on top of last month's outfit. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain told a heroic story. This is from that time I slipped in the mud, but didn't I? To anyone else, they might have looked like they'd given up on hygiene, but the peasants knew better. That crusty tunic was a thermal shield. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death just because you wanted to smell like flowers. Plus, when everyone around you stinks to high heaven, nobody really notices. Nose blindness was a way of life. By February, if you had a thick, greasy outer layer, you were winning at life. And if you picture these guys tucked into plush feather beds with fancy quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic. And by rustic, I mean, let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds were usually just a rough wooden frame, if you were fancy, covered with a big sack stuffed with straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam. No orthopedic support. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled like a barnyard and regret. Every time you turned over, you got a soundtrack of crinkling straw and a sharp jab from a rogue stalk. Some people skipped the frame entirely and just threw the straw on the dirt floor, a luxurious experience modern influencers would probably try to rebrand as earth-connected slumber. But trust me, these straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were also pretty temporary. Over time, that straw would flatten out, get moldy, attract bugs, and basically turn into a biological hazard zone. Changing the straw was a massive deal. Usually done only a few times a year if you were diligent, or, whenever your bed started moving on its own without your permission. Rushes were a popular alternative, too. These were long grasses spread thick across the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary to try and mask the lovely aroma of daily livestock life. Fresh rushes smelled great for about a day. After that, They just became part of the muddy, trampled landscape of the house, blending right in with the dirt, food scraps, and whatever else wandered in. And we can't forget your bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and all sorts of charming critters loved straw bedding almost as much as the peasants did. If you spent more time scratching than actually sleeping, congratulations, you were living the authentic medieval experience. But despite all the hardships, these humble beds were literal lifesavers. Those straw piles were actually a total lifesaver, providing that crucial insulating layer between you and the frozen earth. Plus, clumping together on top of them created little pockets of shared body heat, basically medieval central heating at its finest. So, the next time you sink into your soft, supportive mattress, just remember, somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is looking down at you from history, grinning through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, "Must be nice." When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and pure optimism, you quickly learn that winter breezes aren't just a nuisance, they're personal attacks. Medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold outside, they fought it inside their own homes, armed with nothing but whatever they could cram into the cracks. And trust me, there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, and thatch sagged. The cold seemed to find new ways to sneak in every single night, like a mischievous poltergeist with a grudge. Sealing up the house became an actual art form. People stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of old cloth, bundles of dry grass, and sometimes even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it was getting jammed into a hole somewhere. Some particularly determined souls even smeared extra layers of mud and dung over the outside of their walls as an annual winter project. Imagine standing there in the freezing weather, slapping cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury." Because in a way it was. Roof leaks were the next big battlefield. Thatch, while cheap and plentiful, wasn't exactly waterproof, especially after a few seasons of rain and heavy snow. Peasants would plug roof holes with spare bits of cloth, bundles of reeds, or, in moments of true desperation, chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Eventually, every home started to look like a slightly sad patchwork quilt made by someone who just gave up halfway through. And doors or windows, if you had them, you were lucky. But even then, they were little more than wooden planks held together by iron nails and sheer stubbornness. Window holes were often covered with animal hides or thick cloth soaked in animal fat to block the drafts, which, as a bonus, added a lovely mystery meat aroma to the room. Every night was a battle between human ingenuity and that relentless, sneaky cold. One minute you were warm, and the next, a sudden gust would find the one tiny spot you missed, slapping you awake like a frosty hand of doom. But through a mix of cleverness and a flat-out refusal to accept slightly frozen as a permanent personality trait, they patched and muddled their way through. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake, you realize you can't all sleep at once. So they developed a strategy that would make a military commander proud, sleeping in shifts. It wasn't fancy, no whistles or roll calls, just pure survival. Half the house stayed awake to tend the fire and patch drafts, while the other half curled up under threadbare blankets and hay, trying to catch a few hours of half-frozen sleep. Since restarting a dead fire was about as easy as teaching a stubborn donkey to salsa, someone had to be on ember patrol. And since nobody wanted to get up once they were finally warmish, families rotated. You'd doze for a bit, get elbowed awake, and then stumble over to the hearth to poke, prod, and curse the fire back to life, all while trying not to step on a goat. There were no late-night snacks or snooze buttons here. Just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a growing resentment toward whoever was snoring loudest during your shift. Even kids were pressed into service, learning early that in winter you pull your weight or you freeze trying. And when it was finally your turn to sleep, good luck with the animals rustling, the wind battering the walls, and your sibling accidentally rolling over onto you. Despite the exhaustion, the system worked. Keeping the hearth alive meant the family survived. So next time you grumble about getting up to adjust the thermostat, spare a thought for the peasant squinting into a smoking fire at 3 a.m., wondering if having 10 toes was really that important. You know it's cold when you have to rethink how you breathe just to stay alive. Deep, open-mouthed breathing pulled icy air straight into your lungs. And in a world where pneumonia could kill you faster than you could say a prayer, that was a huge risk. So they practiced survival breathing. Instead of big gulps of air, they kept it shallow, slow, and strictly through the nose. The goal was to warm the air just a tiny bit before it hit their lungs. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than coughing yourself into a grave by February. If you accidentally took a big mouthful of cold air, well, congratulations. You just bought yourself a one-way ticket to a week of hacking up your own soul, with 0 doctors in sight and only your grandma to save you with hot onion tea and very firm prayers. Some people got even more creative and tucked parts of their cloaks or rags over their faces while they slept, creating a makeshift breath warmer. Sure, it meant waking up with a soggy, damp piece of fabric stuck to your mouth by sunrise, but hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Kids were taught these survival hacks early on. Parents would actually scold them for panting like dogs inside the house during winter. And honestly, between the strict breathing lessons, the itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to an aggressively gassy goat, medieval childhood was character building on a whole different level. At night, tucked into your straw bed under a pile of cloaks, right next to a gently steaming cow, breathing became a literal art form. Slow, steady, nose only. It was like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, just with more frostbite and fewer inspirational quotes. It wasn't the flashiest strategy, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, they survived another night in the relentless war against winter. But in the grand survival playbook, peasants discovered an unlikely secret weapon, a full stomach. Turns out, one of the best ways to fight the cold wasn't just another wool cloak. It was stuffing yourself with something heavy right before bed. Calories meant warmth. The more your body had to work to digest, the more internal heat it generated. Its basic medieval thermodynamics: eat a massive meal, spark that internal furnace, and maybe, just maybe, you'd make it to morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So what was on the menu for these freezing nights? Think thick, heavy stews loaded with root vegetables like turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains were absolute lifesavers, too. We're talking oat porridge, barley gruel, or that dense, chewy rye bread that probably doubled as a weapon. If you were having a really lucky day, maybe after a festival or a recent slaughter, you might even get a hunk of salted pork or some dried sausage thrown into the pot. Now, this wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No pretty plating, no artisanal garnishes. It was just one enormous, vaguely brown meal designed to sit in your gut like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the night to keep you just a little bit warmer. It wasn't just about eating a lot, it was about eating smart. Foods that took longer to digest provided a slow, steady trickle of warmth. Fatty foods were the real stars, though, not just for the energy, but because fat burns slower than lean meat. A belly full of stew, bread, and a questionable amount of lard? That was peak medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest kids ate until they were stuffed. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you shivered through the night thinking about how much you missed the turnips. Harsh? Maybe. But it was effective parenting, medieval style. Of course, a heavy meal right before bed had its downsides. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night of bizarre, vivid dreams fueled by a stomach trying to process an entire field's worth of cabbage. Was it worth it? Absolutely. These guys weren't aiming for a Michelin star. They were just aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed, bloated and breathing through your nose next to a steaming cow, well, that was just another night in the quest to see the next sunrise. Long before electric blankets or fancy heated mattress pads, people had to get creative. Enter the unsung heroes of winter, the humble haybox and the ever-glamorous heated stone. Let's start with the haybox. It sounds rustic, and it definitely was, but the idea was pure genius. You'd take a sturdy wooden box, line it thickly with hay, and use it to store food that had been cooked earlier. It kept things warm for hours. Leftover stew? Hot porridge? Toss it in the haybox, cover it up, and you've got a hot late-night snack without having to mess with the fire again. Basically, these were medieval slow cookers. But they didn't just stop at food. They realized that if hay could trap the heat from a stew pot, it could do the same for something even better, rocks. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before heading to bed, someone, probably whichever unlucky child lost the family argument, would grab a flat stone and chuck it right into the heart of the hearth fire. Once it was roasted until it was nearly too hot to touch, it was a fine line between helpful and a third-degree burn. They'd fish it out with a stick or some old tongs. That stone, radiating blissful warmth, would be carefully wrapped in rags, tucked into an old piece of cloth, or jammed into a clay pot, and then slipped under the hay in the mattress or down at the foot of the bed. Boom. You had a medieval heating pad ready to do battle against the frozen earth. Of course, there were risks. If you didn't wrap the stone properly, congratulations, you now had a small, localized house fire. And if you dropped it on your foot, well, let's just say winter injuries weren't always from slipping on ice. But when everything went right, that stone provided precious warmth that could last for hours. It wasn't exactly luxury, but when you're living in a half-frozen hut, luxury is defined as not waking up with icicles dangling from your nose. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just where you cooked dinner, it was practically a family member. Sure, it was a temperamental, smoky, and sometimes uncooperative family member, but it was absolutely essential, especially when it was time to sleep. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. That meant sleeping arrangements were less about personal preference and more about strategic positioning. Infants, the elderly, and anyone sick or frail got first dibs on the prime real estate. Parents, older kids, and the sturdier adults fanned out from there like human insulation layers. Assigning those spots wasn't just out of kindness, it was basic survival math. Babies were fragile heat generators, and elders were precious repositories of family knowledge and, let's be honest, the best gossip. Protecting them with the best warmth was non-negotiable. But it wasn't all cozy toasting by the flames. Too close, and you risked waking up with your hair singed or your cloak smoldering suspiciously. Too far, and you were basically camping in an icebox. It was a delicate dance. You had to stay near enough to bask in the glow, but not so near that you had to explain to your neighbor why you now looked like a half-cooked roast. Plus, the fire didn't spread warmth evenly. It mostly roasted the people directly in front of it, while everyone else fought over the narrow cone of heat like cold lizards jostling for a sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to fall asleep facing the fire, you might have one blissfully warm side and one side so frozen solid you could probably knock on it. Pets and livestock, of course, muscled in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, tail wagging dangerously close to an open flame. Chickens sometimes perched perilously on the hearthstones, clucking softly into the night like tiny, feathery guardians of warmth. Every crackle of the logs, every shift of the glowing embers was a tiny promise. You're still alive. You're still warm for now. And so peasants drifted into uneasy sleep, lulled by the fire's pops and hisses, each breath forming small clouds in the frigid air beyond the fire's fragile circle. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comfortable, but it was life, clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. In the medieval world, No one survived winter alone unless they wanted to become a very stylish frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair. It was a village project, a messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth and life depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone went to check. And not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might be part of it, but because community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, often the young or the elderly, who couldn't work the fields, but could keep an eye on who was coughing too hard, who hadn't come to barter at the market in a few days, or whose home looked a little too still in the morning frost. These people were the medieval version of neighborhood patrol, minus the reflective vests, plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a near emergency. A good neighbor would rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags, or better yet, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yes, it meant squeezing an extra 4 bodies into an already cramped space, but it was better than finding frozen friends come spring thaw. Communal food stores played a role too. During especially brutal winters, villages sometimes pulled their last salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It was grim charity. No one had much, but a few communal meals could be the difference between staggering into spring or not. Even children understood the stakes. They helped deliver wood, shared embers, and ran urgent messages when someone needed help. No one was too small or too tired when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened. Disputes over land, goats, or who borrowed whose good cooking pot never really went away. But when the nights grew deadly cold, old grudges were often quietly shelved. After all, a rival was still worth saving because tomorrow it might be you needing rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one big, stubborn family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, always fiercely determined to survive together. One muddy boot, one crackling ember, one frozen smile at a time. You're still warm, at least for now. And so the peasants would drift into a pretty uneasy sleep, lulled by the pops and hisses of the fire. Every breath they took formed tiny clouds in the frigid air just outside the fire's fragile little circle. It wasn't perfect, and it definitely wasn't comfortable, but it was life. They were clinging to warmth by a thread of glowing coals. In the medieval world, nobody survived winter alone, unless they wanted to become a very stylish frozen statue by January. Survival wasn't just a family affair. It was a full-on village project. It was this messy, muddy, loud collaboration where everyone's warmth literally depended on everyone else. The peasants knew that in the dead of winter, a strong fire and a pile of hay could only do so much. If your neighbor's house went dark, you noticed. If the smoke from old Tom's hearth suddenly stopped curling into the sky, someone went to check. And not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that might have been part of it, but because community meant survival. Villages had these unofficial winter watchers. Usually it was the kids or the elderly who couldn't work the fields, but could keep an eye on who was coughing too much, who hadn't shown up to barter at the market, or whose house looked a little too still in the morning frost. They were basically the medieval neighborhood watch, minus the reflective vests, and plus a lot more sheep. If a family's fire went out, it was a total emergency. A good neighbor would rush over with a glowing coal bundled in rags, or even better, invite them into their own smoky, overcrowded hut for the night. Yeah, it meant squeezing 4 more people into an already cramped space, but it beat finding frozen friends when the spring thaw finally came. Communal food stores were huge, too. During the most brutal winters, villages would sometimes pool their last bits of salted meat and grain. It was grim charity, nobody had much to give, but a few communal meals could be the difference between staggering into spring or not. Even the kids understood the stakes. They helped haul wood, shared embers, and ran messages when someone was in trouble. Nobody was too small when winter came knocking. Sure, medieval villages weren't all sunshine and hugs. Feuds happened. People argued over land, goats, or who borrowed the good cooking pot and didn't bring it back. But when the nights grew deadly cold, those old grudges were usually shelved. After all, your rival was still worth saving because tomorrow you might be the one needing a rescue. In the icy heart of winter, the village became one big, stubborn family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often hilarious, but always fiercely determined to survive together, one muddy boot and one crackling ember at a time. When medieval peasants faced that merciless winter cold, they didn't just pile on cloaks or stoke the fire. They prayed a lot. Because when the wind is howling like a pack of wolves outside your paper-thin walls and the fire is shrinking into tiny, tired embers, you want every possible advantage. You want a little divine intervention. Back then, faith wasn't just a Sunday morning thing, it was woven into every frozen breath. Before crawling under their layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together, offering up hurried prayers to keep the fire burning, the roof intact, and their toes attached by morning. Saints became more than just distant holy figures. They were winter's front-line defense. Saint Blaise, for instance, was the go-to guy for throat ailments. And that wasn't a minor concern when one mouthful of icy air could lead to you hacking up your soul. St. Nicholas wasn't just the jolly Santa Claus we know today. He was the one people begged to protect their households from total ruin during these deadly months. Superstitions were packed snugly right alongside daily survival. Some families would sprinkle a little holy water near the hearth before bed, hoping to keep out evil spirits, or at the very least, mischievous drafts. Others marked their doorways with blessed chalk, pleading for a little luck and warmth to find its way inside. And of course, no serious winter prayer session was complete without some bargaining. Dear Lord, if you just get us through this night, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. It wasn't abstract comfort, it was an urgent daily conversation. They weren't asking for luxury, just one more day to muddle through until spring finally broke the ice. It was raw hope, whispered into smoky rafters and tucked under itchy blankets. But for all the ingenuity and stubbornness they threw at winter, the truth was chilling sometimes. It just wasn't enough. When winter won, it didn't just take a few unlucky people. It could take entire families or whole villages, vanishing them into silence beneath the snow. Some winters were legendary in their cruelty, like the Great Famine of 1315. Rains destroyed the crops, livestock starved, and the freezing temperatures turned a brutal life into a slow-motion disaster. People got so desperate that stories whispered of them eating shoe leather, tree bark, and in the most horrifying cases, each other. Letting the fire go out wasn't just a mistake, it was often a death sentence. Without that meager warmth, families would huddle together for the last time. Neighbors would sometimes stumble across entire households in the spring, bodies still locked in a frozen embrace, as if they were trying to share just a little more heat until the very end. Even the houses themselves could give up. A roof collapsing under heavy snow in the middle of a frozen night wasn't just a mess, it was usually fatal. And dragging yourself through thigh-deep snow to beg for shelter was never a guarantee, especially if your neighbors were already at their breaking point. Disease loved the cold, too. Starvation weakened everyone, and those cramped, smoky huts became the perfect breeding grounds for pneumonia and infections. A simple cough in December could easily lead to a funeral by January. And then there was the quiet, lingering horror of frostbite. Fingers, toes, and even ears would blacken and die while still attached to their owners. Some villagers survived the winter, but at a heavy cost. Their limbs. It was a grim badge of honor that basically said, I made it through, but winter took a piece of me. But what's most haunting isn't just the death, it's how eerie and normal it all felt. People just accepted that every year, Some of them wouldn't see the spring thaw. Death wasn't an unexpected guest, it was just another neighbor at the door, wrapped in frost, waiting for its turn. Yet, even with that constant threat, they pressed on, stubborn, grieving, and clinging to life. Because as long as there was one single ember left in the hearth and one breath hanging in the cold air, there was still a fight worth fighting. When we look back at these muddy, frost-bitten survivors, it's easy to see only the struggle, the cracked hands and the smoke-choked huts. But buried beneath all that is something far more powerful, a legacy of raw, unbreakable endurance. They didn't have central heating or memory foam, but they did have the ultimate blueprint for resilience. Every hay-stuffed mattress and every moss-crammed wall gap was a testament to human creativity under pressure. They didn't collapse in despair, they adapted. They learned from the land and from each other. They lived by the rule that nobody beats winter alone. Their faith wasn't just about fear either. It was a kind of stubborn hope that after 100 dark nights, spring would eventually push through the frozen ground. And somehow, it always did. Because of their sacrifices and those unglamorous victories, just surviving one more night, future generations thrived. Their ingenuity is stitched invisibly into the lives we live today. Every cozy blanket and every warm house we enjoy is the end result of countless peasants refusing to give in to the cold. So, the next time the wind howls outside your window, maybe spare a thought for them. The nameless, fearless ones who turned shivering survival into a living legacy, one ember and one stubborn heartbeat at a time. The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn. Anne wasn't just another girl born into a noble family. She was a life that would one day completely tilt the course of English history. Even as a child, she stood out, not because of her money, but because of her mind. She was sharp, spirited, and had this magnetic energy that people just couldn't help but notice. Recognizing her potential, her family sent her to the continent, and that's where her real education began. First, she served Margaret of Austria in the glittering courts of the Netherlands, an experience most English girls could only dream of. There, Anne soaked up the art of diplomacy, refined manners, and the subtle dance of European politics. But it was in France where she truly found her shine. She spent years in the sophisticated courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, mastering the languages of influence, elegance, flirtation, wit, and sharp conversation. While other young women were perfecting their embroidery, Anne was mastering the art of commanding a room without ever seeming like she was trying. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was something rare. She was a woman who could rival the sophistication of any European courtier while carrying the massive ambition of a rising English house. She wasn't a classic beauty. Even her admirers said that much. But she was arresting. She had these dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence, a quick musical voice, and a way of moving that felt purposeful. Anne didn't just enter a room, she changed its gravity. At a time when a woman's fate was usually sealed by her birth or her marriage, Anne refused to just drift into the background. She had seen the power that charm and intellect could hold, and she intended to use it. The girl who returned to England was no longer just Thomas's daughter. She was a player in a much larger game, one that would soon engulf the crown itself. When she finally stepped back into the English court, she was unlike anyone the nobility had ever seen. In a world full of modest, pale-faced English roses, Anne was a thunderstorm, electric, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. Her dark hair, bold eyes, and razor-sharp wit set her apart from the gentle, obedient ladies surrounding King Henry VIII. At first, she played the role expected of her as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But even in the Queen's shadow, Anne's presence flickered like a candle too bright to blow out. She danced gracefully, spoke French like a native, and laughed with a confidence most women didn't dare show. Men noticed. Women gossiped. The entire court was buzzing about the striking Boleyn girl. It wasn't long before she caught the most dangerous attention of all, the king himself. Henry VIII was no stranger to flirtation. His court was basically a playground of secret promises and liaisons. But Anne was different. She didn't swoon at his compliments or fall eagerly into his arms like so many others had. Instead, she teased him. She challenged him. She straight up refused him. Henry, a man who was used to getting exactly what he wanted, exactly when he wanted it, was completely captivated. The more Anne held him at arm's length, the harder he fell. Letters started flying back and forth, filled with intense declarations of love, frustration, and deep longing. Henry eventually offered her the role of royal mistress, which was basically the most powerful unofficial job at court. And Anne? She astonishingly said no. She wasn't interested in being just another conquest or a mistress forgotten by history. If Henry wanted her, he'd have to make her his wife. It was a gamble so incredibly bold that it stunned the entire court. I mean, the king was already married. His queen, Catherine, was loved by the public and backed by the Holy Roman Emperor. To get to Anne, Henry would have to defy the church itself. But Anne didn't flinch. She'd spent years in European courts seeing how queens wielded power behind soft fans and painted smiles. She knew ambition was a dangerous game, but she was playing to win. In those candlelit halls, she made her choice. She wasn't just going to be admired, she was going to change her destiny, and England's, forever. What started as an intense flirtation soon spiraled into a full-blown national crisis. Henry wasn't just into her anymore, he was obsessed. And in that obsession, he was willing to tear apart everything England had known for centuries. Of course, his plan to marry Anne hit a major snag, Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was dignified, resilient, and absolutely refused to just quietly go away. She'd been Henry's faithful wife for 20 years, and to the English people, she was the one and only rightful queen. A divorce wasn't just scandalous, it was almost unthinkable. But Henry was determined. He convinced himself, and tried to convince everyone else, that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she'd originally been married to his brother Arthur. Never mind that the Pope had already cleared that years ago, Henry now insisted his soul was in danger unless the marriage was annulled. Anne, meanwhile, was too smart to look too eager. She kept herself just out of reach, expertly balancing between encouraging Henry's hopes and maintaining her distance. Every glance and every word was calculated. She wasn't just aiming for a wedding ring, she was positioning herself to be the Queen of England. The court was a mess of whispers and rival factions. Some noble families started sucking up to Anne, seeing where the power was shifting, while others clung to Queen Catherine, completely horrified at the idea of Anne taking her place. Diplomats were sending frantic letters back to Rome, foreign kings were threatening to retaliate, and even Henry's own advisors were starting to get really twitchy, feeling the ground shake beneath their feet. As months dragged into years, Henry's frustration hit a breaking point. He bombarded the Pope with petitions and had his lawyers looking for every possible loophole, but he slowly realized the church wasn't going to budge. Catherine had some serious backup, including her nephew, Emperor Charles V, basically the most powerful man in Europe. But Henry didn't care. He pushed forward, defying advice, tradition, and eventually the law itself. His obsession with Anne had turned into something way bigger than just personal desire. It was now a direct challenge to the entire political and religious structure of England. Anne wasn't just capturing a king's heart. She was dragging an entire kingdom into totally uncharted waters. There was officially no turning back. After nearly 7 agonizing years of scandals and diplomatic chaos, Anne's massive gamble finally paid off. In January 1533, she secretly married Henry. It was an incredibly bold move, especially since in the eyes of the Pope and most of Europe, he was still technically married to Catherine. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a huge, lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the greatest moment of her life, but the vibe was complicated. The people of London watched with mixed feelings. Some cheered, but others were literally whispering prayers for Queen Catherine. A lot of people wondered if this new queen, with her French flair and daring attitude, was a blessing or a total curse. Anne didn't step into her role as a beloved figure. She entered like a storm. Unlike Catherine, who was the definition of traditional humility, Anne was dazzling, provocative, and politically sharp. She wore bold colors, ran the court with her intelligence, and made some very powerful enemies at record speed. But even though she was queen, her position was terrifyingly fragile. Everything, literally everything, depended on one thing: giving Henry a male heir. Anne knew this better than anyone. She wasn't just the king's wife anymore, she was the hope of a whole dynasty. When she first got pregnant, she and Henry were over the moon, convinced the baby would be a boy. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. To her credit, Anne hid her crushing disappointment with total grace, promising Henry that the next one would definitely be a son. Henry, though, wasn't as good at hiding his feelings. His eyes, which used to be full of nothing but love, were starting to show the first flickers of doubt. Still, for a while, Anne's star burned bright. She completely remade the English court in her own image, elevated her family to heights they'd never dreamed of, and even became the first queen in English history to be crowned with the sacred oil usually reserved only for kings. Her influence was massive. Foreign ambassadors were begging for her favor, and courtiers were constantly reshuffling their alliances just to stay on her good side. Henry, who used to be so obedient to Anne's every wish, officially started pulling England away from Rome. He created the Church of England with himself at the top, all so that nobody could ever question Anne's crown. But even in her moment of triumph, dark clouds were moving in. Friends were whispering behind their hands, rivals were circling like sharks, and Henry, fickle and restless as always, was already starting to look past the brilliant woman who had literally rewritten the kingdom for him. Anne had won the throne, but keeping it was going to take way more than just charm or ambition. The thing is, the higher you rise, the harder you fall. Almost the second she put that crown on, the cracks started to show. At the center of it all was that massive pressure to produce a male heir. Her first child, Elizabeth, was healthy and bright, but she wasn't the son Henry had staked his entire dynasty on. And the clock was ticking. Anne went through multiple pregnancies in a row, but heartbreak followed every single time. Miscarriages left her physically weak and emotionally wrecked. Each lost child chipped away at the foundation she had built. Henry, who used to be passionately devoted, started pulling away, his disappointment creating a huge rift between them. Anne wasn't the type to suffer in silence. She argued, she demanded, and she fought to keep her place. But Henry, a man who prized obedience just as much as beauty, was getting tired of her sharpness and defiance, the very fire that had attracted him in the first place. Outside the bedroom doors, her enemies were gathering like wolves. A lot of nobles who had tolerated her rise with gritted teeth were now openly plotting her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters never forgave her, and even the common people whispered against her, blaming her for the split with Rome. And then came Jane Seymour, quiet, demure, and basically everything Anne was not. Jane caught Henry's wandering eye just as Anne's influence was starting to fade. Where Anne had dazzled him with her brilliance and challenges, Jane offered soothing compliance. It was a dangerous shift, and Anne, being as sharp as she was, saw it happening. She tried everything to reclaim her spot, lavishing attention on Henry, promising more sons, begging for patience. But the king had already started imagining a life without the woman he had once torn a kingdom apart for. Even her former allies, like Thomas Cromwell, sensed the tide was turning. They started laying the groundwork for her destruction, quietly gathering rumors, accusations, and witnesses. The woman who had played the game of ambition so perfectly was now losing ground. In the brutal world of Henry's court, past victories meant nothing. Only fresh success mattered, and Anne's enemies were sharpening their knives. The queen who had shattered a kingdom was about to find out how quickly a kingdom could shatter her. Anne's enemies didn't come at her with armies or swords. They came with whispers, secrets, and carefully sharpened lies. In the back rooms of the court, a betrayal was brewing, silent, patient, and deadly. Thomas Cromwell, who used to be Anne's biggest ally during the English Reformation, had completely turned against her. Their alliance was built on shared ambition, but now their goals were clashing. Anne wanted real reforms to help the poor and limit the power of greedy nobles, while Cromwell just wanted stability, the king's favor, and zero interference. Anne's boldness had made her dangerous, and in Henry's fickle heart, love had curdled into irritation, suspicion, and cold detachment. Anne had almost no true friends left. Even her charm, which was once her greatest weapon, now just grated on a court that was hungry for a gentler, easier-to-handle queen. And Jane Seymour, quiet and calculating, was waiting just out of sight, the perfect contrast to Anne's fading fire. Cromwell was the one who moved first. He knew Henry was restless and looking for an exit, but the king didn't have a convenient excuse, so Cromwell offered a solution. What if Anne could be removed not by a messy divorce, which would humiliate Henry, but by total disgrace? The accusations they came up with were wild and monstrous: adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king. Anne, the proud and brilliant queen, was painted as a betrayer and a threat to the very crown she had once redefined. Cromwell carefully gathered evidence, coaxing confessions under torture and twisting simple courtly flirtations into damning testimony. Several men, including Anne's own brother, George, were arrested. The charges made almost no sense. They were full of contradictions. But in Henry's court, the truth was whatever the king needed it to be. Anne felt the noose tightening and fought back desperately. She appealed to Henry's memory and the love they once shared, but it was useless. The man who had once torn England apart for her now refused to even look her in the eye. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. As the heavy gates slammed shut behind her, she knew the truth. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner, a pawn trapped in the brutal game she had once played so masterfully. Betrayal had sealed her fate. Anne then stood in the great hall of the Tower, facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom actually owed their titles to her rise. Now they sat in judgment, cold and watchful, ready to erase her. The charges were shocking, even in that world. But this wasn't a trial, it was theater. It was a grim performance designed to give Henry exactly what he wanted: Anne's downfall wrapped in a thin veil of legality. Anne defended herself with that same fire that had once won Henry's heart. She denied every single accusation with intelligence, precision, and a calm that astonished even her enemies. She reminded them that she was the anointed queen, chosen by God. She reminded them of her loyalty and her love. But it was all for nothing. The verdict had been decided long before she even stepped into that courtroom. The trial was just a spectacle, a public unmaking of a woman who was once thought to be unbreakable. Witness after witness, many of them bribed or forced, stood up and said things that simply weren't true. Dates didn't match, places didn't make sense, and the evidence was flimsy at best. But honestly, the truth didn't matter anymore. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other men accused with her were also sentenced to death. Anne was to be beheaded, which in that world was actually considered a merciful sentence compared to the brutal ways traitors were usually executed. When the verdict was read, she didn't break. She stood tall, her face pale but her spirit clearly intact. Right before being led back to her cell, she spoke clearly, saying she was ready to die and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors closed behind her, the court took a breath of relief. The storm that was Anne, brilliant, dangerous, and unforgettable, was almost over. But what they didn't realize was that they weren't erasing her. They were immortalizing her in a story of betrayal and legend. Back in the Tower of London, Anne wasn't the triumphant queen anymore. She was a condemned prisoner just waiting for the end. Yet even facing death, she refused to fall apart. She spent hours praying on those cold stone floors, her voice steady and her hands clasped tight. She didn't confess to any crimes because, in her heart, she knew she hadn't committed any. She said she wasn't afraid to die, but she prayed her death would bring peace to England and, more importantly, mercy for her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, the few who stayed loyal, were crying in private. In a strange twist, Anne was the one comforting them. She even joked bitterly at times, saying she'd be remembered as the queen who lost her head. That stubborn spark of humor was exactly what made her so unforgettable. Meanwhile, Henry showed zero mercy. He'd already moved on to Jane Seymour. Even before the execution date was set, he was busy arranging his next wedding. For Anne, this final betrayal from the man who had once torn a kingdom apart for her must have been the deepest cut of all. On May 18, 1536, she was told she would die the next morning. She barely slept that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking for forgiveness for everyone who had wronged her, and maybe for herself, too, for the ambition and pride that had brought her to this point. In a small flicker of royal kindness, Henry had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution. It was faster and cleaner than an axe. A small mercy bought more for the king's own conscience than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, Anne dressed carefully for her final moment. She chose a dark gray damask gown trimmed with fur and a crimson slip beneath, colors of dignity and sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair and tucked it under a simple cap, ready to face the blade with grace. As the cold morning mist curled around the stones of the Tower courtyard, Anne, queen, mother, survivor, and fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears and no begging, just one final act of courage. Her end was near, but her story was actually just beginning. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne ascended the scaffold. A small crowd had gathered. Courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all wrapped in a silence so thick it felt like even the stone walls were holding their breath. Anne stood tall, her gown fluttering slightly in the breeze. She looked thinner than she had at court, her face pale but remarkably calm. There was no hysteria, no sobbing. If anything, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once brought a kingdom to its knees. She spoke briefly, choosing her final words with extreme care. She didn't accuse anyone, and she didn't even try to defend herself. Instead, she prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had abandoned her. In those last moments, Anne didn't give the world a confession. She gave it forgiveness. Her courage stunned even the people who had come specifically to watch her fall. The French executioner stepped forward. Anne knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer and her eyes lifted toward the heavens. A small white cloth was tied over her eyes. She stayed perfectly still. The sword flashed once, silent and swift, and just like that, Anne Boleyn was gone. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave within the Tower grounds, laid to rest in an old arrow chest because nobody had even bothered to prepare a proper coffin for her. A queen once crowned in gold was left to vanish without ceremony. But Anne's story didn't end in that cold grave. Daughter Elizabeth, the child whose birth had once been such a disappointment to the king, would eventually rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose reign would see the absolute flowering of English art, power, and global influence. She was a queen who inherited every bit of her mother's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. Anne Boleyn changed the course of England forever. Her ambition triggered the break with Rome, and her fall showed the world that even queens could be cast aside. Yet, through Elizabeth's blood, Anne's legacy blazed brighter than any crown she had ever worn in life. In the end, Anne won a kind of immortality, not by surviving, but by leaving an indelible mark on history. The American Revolution, and the Boston Tea Party fast forward to the early 1770s. The American colonies were simmering like a pot left way too long over a roaring fire. The relationship with Britain, which used to be the proud mother country, had soured into deep resentment, suspicion, and growing fury. And it didn't actually start with tea. Years earlier, the Stamp Act had enraged colonists by taxing everything from newspapers to playing cards. Then came the Townshend Acts, taxing essentials like paper, glass, and paint. Every new law passed thousands of miles away by a parliament where the colonists had zero representation was like another spark landing in dry brush. At first, the anger was polite, petitions and fiery pamphlets. Writers like Samuel Adams filled newspapers with passionate arguments about liberty. But as time went on, the frustration turned into something darker. There was this slow, painful realization Britain wasn't listening. Worse, Britain didn't care. The colonists tried to reason. Sometimes Parliament would repeal a tax like they did with the Stamp Act after the massive protests, but every small victory was followed by a new insult. It wasn't about the money. The taxes were actually pretty modest. What infuriated them was the principle. They were being taxed without consent, treated like distant possessions rather than citizens or partners. Boston became the beating heart of the resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive and fiery group of patriots, grew bolder every day. In 1770, tensions exploded into the Boston Massacre, and trust became a thing of the past. By 1773, the colonies were teetering on the edge. The final insult didn't come from an army. It came in the quiet, seemingly harmless shape of crates stacked with tea. In 1773, Parliament made a massive miscalculation. They thought the colonies would quietly accept cheaper tea, so they passed the Tea Act to save the struggling British East India Company. On paper, it looked like a great deal. They cut out the middlemen, slashed prices, and offered a luxury product at a bargain. What could go wrong? Everything. Because the problem wasn't the price, it was the principle. The Tea Act kept that hated tea tax firmly in place. Accepting that tea, even at a discount, meant acknowledging Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. To many Americans, that was a total surrender of their liberty. The news spread like wildfire. Merchants were fuming because a monopoly was threatening their trade, and patriots were raging at the trap disguised as a bargain. In Boston, the reaction was especially fierce. Refusing that tea became a matter of honor, a litmus test for loyalty to the cause of liberty. Public meetings started swelling to sizes no one had ever seen before. Newspaper columns were practically burning with fiery rhetoric. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, organized massive boycotts, vowing that not a single leaf of East India Company tea would be unloaded, sold, or even touched on American soil. All across the colonies, ships carrying that controversial tea were being turned away by local resistance. From New York to Charleston, the message was loud and clear: we will not be bought. But in Boston, fate took a different, more stubborn turn. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived and anchored in the harbor, and then they just sat there. Royal officials insisted the tea be unloaded. The colonists absolutely refused. It was a total deadlock, as tense as a drawn bowstring. The tension was becoming unbearable, and everyone knew that a single act would break it, and once it broke, history would never be the same. As those ships sat stubbornly in the harbor, Boston transformed into a literal powder keg. Every day that passed without a resolution just tightened the screws. Boston wasn't just resisting anymore, it was preparing for a full-on fight. In taverns, churches, and public squares, people were debating their next move. The Sons of Liberty, with guys like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, were moving fast to organize the chaos. They posted notices everywhere and held rowdy meetings that were packed with everyone from farmers to wealthy merchants. The Old South Meeting House became the nerve center of the whole thing. Thousands of people crammed into that wooden hall, their breath fogging up the air as their voices rose in defiance. This is where the real work happened. Resolutions were passed, tempers boiled over, and every vote against unloading that tea was another hammer blow against British authority. But while the people were united, the clock was ticking. Hard. British law was very specific. Imported goods like tea had to be unloaded, and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships were still there after that deadline, customs officials would seize the cargo, and the tax would be collected by force. The Sons of Liberty knew that if that tax was paid, even under protest, the principle would be lost forever. It wasn't just about the tea anymore. It was about a much bigger question. Would the colonies accept being treated as subjects without rights, or would they finally stand up and fight for their future? Meanwhile, the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, was digging in his heels. He flat out refused to let those tea ships leave without unloading their cargo. To him, backing down wasn't just about tea. It was about who was in charge. He felt that giving in meant admitting that mobs, not monarchs, ruled the colonies. He didn't care about the colonial outrage, he wanted the law obeyed. Boston's standoff had become a total spectacle. Every man, woman, and child knew that something was coming. You could feel it in the air, that cold, sharp silence you get right before a storm when the whole world holds its breath. All it was going to take was one spark to ignite an explosion, and somewhere in those crowded streets and even more crowded hearts, a decision was quietly taking shape. A plan was being made that would soon echo across oceans and empires. December 16, 1773, dawned gray and freezing. For nearly 3 weeks, those ships had sat in the harbor like ticking time bombs, and now the final deadline was here. If that tea wasn't unloaded and the tax paid by the end of the day, British customs officials could seize it, and the troops could be called in. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea came ashore, the principle of no taxation without representation was dead. If they allowed it even once, their entire cause would unravel. That morning, thousands of people packed into the Old South Meeting House. It was so crowded that men were spilling out into the streets, straining to hear the fiery speeches inside. Samuel Adams, the iron voice of the rebellion, was presiding over the whole thing. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act and cry out against tyranny. But even with all that defiance, there was this heavy cloud of uncertainty. How could they stop the tea without starting an outright war? How could they resist without inviting brutal retaliation? As the afternoon went on, riders galloped in with grim news. Governor Hutchinson wasn't moving. The ships wouldn't be allowed to leave. The tea would be seized, the tax collected, and the king's law enforced. Period. The crowd was buzzing with pure fury. It felt like the walls of the meeting house were actually shuddering from the tension. Then Samuel Adams stood up calmly and said the words that signaled the end of all talk. "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country." It was a simple sentence, but everyone knew exactly what it meant. No more petitions, no more compromises. It was time for action. Outside, a war whoop cut through the gathering gloom. That was the signal. Men began disguising themselves quickly, smearing soot on their faces and throwing on blankets and feathers in a crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. The goal wasn't to fool anyone with those outfits. It was about creating a symbol, a message that no one could possibly mistake. The deadline was up, and Boston was finally going to answer. Not with more letters or petitions, but with total defiance. As the sun went down over Boston on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets started to come alive. Figures moved through the shadows, ordinary guys wrapped in rough blankets, their faces smeared with soot, some even wearing feathers. They weren't trying to trick people into thinking they were actual Mohawk warriors. Their disguise was symbolic. It was about shedding their old identities and taking a stand as something new and fierce. By the dozens, they made their way to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, were anchored. The harbor water was churning cold and dark, with a sharp bite of winter air. There was no shouting, no drunken chaos, no rioting. This was a mission carried out with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised colonists swarmed the ships, pushing the few crew members aside. No harm came to the sailors. They just stood there in silence, watching the operation begin. The men split open the wooden chests with practiced blows, and the fragrant smell of fresh tea filled the freezing night air. Chest after chest, 342 in total, was broken and dumped until the black water was swirling with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. People watched from the wharf in a kind of stunned silence. Even the British guards nearby didn't make a move to stop it. Whether they were confused, actually sympathized with the cause, or were just scared of starting a massacre, nobody knows. But even among the loyalists, there was this feeling that something had shifted, and there was no stopping it now. The discipline was honestly extraordinary. No other cargo was touched. No one raided the ships for valuables. They only targeted the tea, the hated symbol of British oppression. In a town where hunger and hardship were everywhere, these men could have easily turned this into a looting spree. But they didn't. When it was over, the harbor looked like a giant swirling cauldron filled with broken wood and soaking tea leaves. The scent of the salt sea mixed with the sharp tang of smashed tea, filling the night with a strange, bittersweet smell. The work was done. Silently, the men disappeared into the alleys and back streets of Boston. They left behind no names, no leaders, and no claims to fame, just the unmistakable mark of a revolution. As the last broken crates bobbed in the dark water, Boston stood still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a riot or a drunken spectacle. It was something much rarer, an act of cold, deliberate defiance carried out under the cover of night. The harbor was basically turned into one giant, swirling teapot. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea floated in massive mats on the surface, staining the water black. Some colonists, half curious and half rebellious, tried to scoop up handfuls of the soaked leaves from the water, but they were immediately shut down by the Sons of Liberty, patrolling the docks. Nothing was to be salvaged. No one was going to profit from that night's work. This was about principle, pure and simple. The next morning, the whole town woke up to the smell of salty tea hanging heavy in the air. The news spread like wildfire through word of mouth, letters, and broadsheets. By midday, everyone from young apprentices to wealthy merchants knew exactly what had happened, and opinions split fast. Among the patriots, there was this fierce, swelling pride that ordinary men had stood up to the mightiest empire in the world and struck a real blow for liberty. But among the loyalists and moderates, there was total horror. To them, destroying property was reckless and dangerous. They wondered, had the colonies finally crossed a line they couldn't walk back from? Governor Thomas Hutchinson was absolutely raging in his mansion. He wasn't just mad about the destruction. He was furious about the message it sent. He knew that if the king's authority could be defied so brazenly in Boston, rebellion could spark anywhere. British officials were genuinely stunned. They had expected protests, boycotts, or maybe another messy riot like the ones over the Stamp Act. What they didn't expect were organized, disciplined revolutionaries who could calmly destroy tens of thousands of pounds of royal property without so much as breaking a single window. The captains of the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver could do nothing but watch helplessly as their entire cargo disappeared beneath the waves. In the official records, that night cost over £10,000, a total fortune back then. But the real loss wasn't about the money or the ruined tea. It was about the trust and loyalty that just went up in smoke. The fragile idea that Britain could rule the colonies without their okay was gone. As those tea chests sank, a deeper truth floated to the top. The time for polite protests was over. A massive reckoning was coming, and Boston was ready for it. When news of the Tea Party finally hit London, the reaction was fast and furious. To British officials, this wasn't just some protest. It was an open, mocking middle finger to the king's authority. King George III reportedly went cold with rage, and Parliament, already fed up with years of the colonies not listening, just exploded. They didn't want to just punish Boston, they wanted to scare every other colony into submission. The result was a set of laws so brutal that Americans immediately started calling them the Intolerable Acts. The first blow was the Boston Port Act. In one heartless move, Parliament shut down Boston's busy harbor, the city's entire economic lifeline. No ships in, no ships out, until the tea was paid for. Just like that, the trade vanished and the docks went dead silent. The harbor was locked tight, and the tension was just getting started. Trade just vanished. Supplies dried up, and Boston, usually so loud and full of life, went quiet, with its docks feeling eerily still. But Britain didn't stop there. They passed the Massachusetts Government Act, which basically hijacked the colony's right to rule itself and handed the keys to the king's officials. Then came the Administration of Justice Act, which let royal officers get away with almost anything by sending them back to Britain for trial, a loud and clear message that they were untouchable. To top it off, they made sure the colonists knew they weren't afraid to use force. British soldiers were moved directly into the city, living right in the middle of the people they were there to control. The Crown's message was simple: rebellion will be crushed, and liberty is a luxury we won't allow anymore. But Parliament's heavy-handed move backfired big time. Instead of scaring the other colonies into playing nice, it just made them furious. When news hit that Boston's port was closed and people were literally starving under martial law, it triggered a wave of sympathy and righteous anger across the continent. Suddenly, wagon loads of food and supplies started pouring into Boston from neighboring colonies. What used to be just a Massachusetts problem was rapidly becoming an American one. Britain wanted to make Boston a warning. Instead, they made it a rallying cry for the resistance. Those flames of revolution, which used to just flicker in small pockets, were now a full-on blaze spreading from colony to colony. The crackdown sent shockwaves way beyond the Massachusetts coast. Across all 13 colonies, that outrage turned into the one thing Britain feared most: unity. For ages, the colonies had acted like distant cousins, always bickering over trade, religion, or borders. But once the harbor was slammed shut, people from Virginia to New Hampshire realized that if it could happen to Boston, it could happen to them too. The response was fast, it was loud, and it changed everything. The colonies were finally standing together. Colonists started sending wagons packed with food, supplies, and letters of solidarity to the people in Boston who were really struggling. Town meetings were buzzing with anger, and newspaper printers were working overtime to spread the word. The fight wasn't just Boston's anymore. It belonged to everyone. Because of all this, something huge happened in September 1774. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. For the first time ever, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies were under one roof to figure out a united plan. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, and the Adams cousins, who used to just be big names in their own regions, were now standing together as the architects of a massive movement. Officially, they weren't aiming for full independence yet. Most of them still hoped they could patch things up and go back to a respectful relationship with the British Crown. But underneath all the polite debates and carefully worded petitions, a deeper truth was taking hold. The colonies couldn't afford to be divided anymore. At the Congress, they agreed to a massive boycott of British goods and promised to have each other's backs if Britain pushed any further. They made it crystal clear an attack on one colony was an attack on all of them. In taverns and meeting houses all over the continent, ordinary people started openly using words that used to be whispered in secret: unity, resistance, liberty. Britain thought that by dropping the hammer on Boston, they'd crush the rebellion. Instead, they accidentally built a nation. Instead of crushing the rebellion, Britain's crackdown welded the colonies together into something way more dangerous: a people who, despite their differences, were starting to see themselves not as scattered provinces, but as Americans. The winds of revolution weren't just a breeze anymore. They were turning into a full-blown storm, and it was too late for Britain to stop it. The night that tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't just crates being destroyed. It was the illusion that the colonies would stay loyal subjects forever. The Boston Tea Party lit a spark that no king, no army, and no distant parliament could ever blow out. In the months that followed, that spark turned into a wildfire. What used to be polite petitions and boycotts hardened into open resistance. Local militias started drilling in public, and storehouses were being filled with gunpowder and ammo. Men who used to toast King George III in taverns were now whispering about revolution in those same seats. Boston became a symbol of sacrifice. Battered, for sure, but definitely not broken. Every time Britain tried to tighten its grip, the colonies just slipped through its fingers. Every ship sailing past the silent, closed-off harbor of Boston was a reminder that tyranny had finally met its match. When Parliament passed the intolerable acts to scare everyone, they accidentally created a martyr and a rallying cry. From Georgia to New Hampshire, colonists realized they were all in this together. It wasn't about tea anymore. It was about survival, identity, and freedom. By the spring of 1775, things reached a boiling point just outside Boston. In the villages of Lexington and Concord, British troops sent to seize weapons ran into armed farmers, ordinary guys ready to defend their rights with muskets. The first shots of the American Revolution rang out, and you can trace a direct line back to that moment when men chose principle over profit and dumped a fortune's worth of tea into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party showed the world that a revolution doesn't always start with trumpets and banners. Sometimes it starts quietly with a small group of determined people standing in the cold, choosing defiance over fear. By dumping that tea, they weren't just rejecting a tax. They were rejecting an entire empire. The ancient civilization of Caral, Peru. Long before the pyramids of Giza were built, before Mesopotamian cities were buzzing with life, and before Stonehenge even stood against the sky, there was Caral. Tucked away in the dry valleys of coastal Peru, Caral rose in silent majesty, nearly 5,000 years ago, only to fade into complete oblivion, swallowed by the sand and forgotten by history. For centuries, the world didn't even know it was there. The Soup Valley, where Caral once thrived, looks like an unlikely place for a civilization to bloom at first glance. It's parched and barren, with the river looking like nothing more than a thin silver thread winding through dust and rocks. Most people would call it inhospitable. Yet, right there in the middle of that desolation, one of humanity's first great cities took shape. Caral wasn't just a few scattered huts or a temporary trading post. It was a massive, planned city sprawling over 150 acres. It was filled with pyramids, plazas, residential areas, and ceremonial spaces. It had scale, purpose, and a real vision. A complex society blossoming centuries before the Egyptians even started stacking stones for their own pyramids. The people of Caral pulled this off without the wheel, without a written language, and without any metal tools. They built massive stone and earth structures using nothing but ingenuity, teamwork, and raw human will. But for thousands of years, Caral remained a secret. Even when travelers stumbled across the strange, weathered mounds in the valley, they just thought they were natural hills shaped by the desert wind. No one imagined that beneath the sand lay one of the oldest cities in the world, predating even the civilizations that history books had always called the first. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologists, led by Ruth Shady, finally uncovered the truth. What they found buried in the dust would rewrite the entire story of the Americas and force the world to rethink everything we thought we knew about the birth of civilization. Caral had risen, flourished, and fallen in total anonymity. Now, after thousands of years of silence, those stones are finally speaking again. They're whispering about a peaceful, intelligent people who built a complex and amazing world in a place where life seemed almost impossible. And honestly, this was just the beginning of their story. At first glance, the Soup Valley looks like a place where life should be a constant struggle. You've got harsh winds sweeping across endless sand and stone, and a merciless sun baking the ground into brittle, cracked sheets. Water is so scarce that the river looks like it's fighting for its own survival. To most people, it looks like a barren wasteland forgotten by the gods. But the people of Carroll saw something different. They didn't see a desert to be afraid of, they saw a canvas. They realized that the river, as modest as it was the lifeblood of everything. So, with a ton of patience and sheer determination, they turned this unforgiving place into a thriving oasis. Their first big win was agriculture. They figured out how to tame the river's seasonal floods by building these simple but brilliant irrigation systems that moved water across the valley floor. Where anyone else would see sand and dust, they coaxed up green shoots of hope, things like beans, squash, guava, and sweet potatoes. Cotton, though, was their real treasure. They spun it into fishing nets and textiles, which fueled trade with villages on the coast and created bonds that stretched far beyond their desert home. But mastering crops was only part of the genius. The people of Carroll knew that surviving in the desert required a perfect balance. They worked with nature instead of fighting it. They built their homes and plazas from stone and earth, designing them to survive both the scorching heat and the rare heavy rains that would occasionally hit the valley. They even studied the stars and the seasons, planning their harvests with the precision of master astronomers. Trade became the very veins and arteries of Carroll's economy. Dried fish, cotton, fruits, and handmade goods were constantly flowing up and down the coast, keeping the city alive and growing. In exchange for what they grew, Carroll brought in some seriously exotic stuff. We're talking colorful shells from the Pacific, rare stones from the Andes, and even new ideas from distant cultures. They weren't just stuck out in the desert alone, they were incredibly well connected. In a place where just staying alive should have been a struggle, Carroll thrived because they were smart, innovative, and stuck together. They didn't try to beat the desert into submission with brute force. Instead, they partnered with it, learning its rhythms, respecting its power, and building a society that wasn't just functional, it was extraordinary. Against all odds, Carroll blossomed into a massive beacon of civilization, and it was really just the beginning of their climb. Rising out of the desert like ancient guardians, the pyramids of Carroll completely rewrite everything we thought we knew about early civilization in the Americas. They built these structures to connect the earth and the sky, their community and the cosmos, and humanity with eternity. Even now they still whisper across the sand, telling a story that just refuses to be forgotten. But there's something truly different about the ruins of Carroll. Something that sets it apart from almost every other ancient civilization we know. Archaeologists haven't found any weapons buried in the sand. There are no defensive walls surrounding its plazas, and no mass graves hinting at bloody wars or internal fighting. Unlike so many kingdoms that rose and fell through violence, Carroll was a society built on peace. It's a huge revelation that really flips our expectations. This was a civilization that thrived through cooperation, trade, and shared beliefs instead of conquest. The people of Carroll didn't pour their energy into building armies or fortresses, they invested it in architecture, astronomy, music, and community life. Their pyramids weren't monuments to victory over an enemy, they were centers for celebration, worship, and leadership. This was a society that chose to gather rather than conquer, and to negotiate rather than destroy. Trade was the real secret to their success. They grew cotton along the riverbanks and spun it into fishing nets to trade with coastal communities. In return, Carroll got dried fish, a major source of protein, and exotic goods from all over. We're talking colorful shells from the Pacific, precious stones from the highlands, and even tropical fruits from distant valleys. This massive trade network stitched the whole region together, creating a peaceful web where everyone benefited. And Carroll sat right at the center as the cultural and economic heart of it all. Religion and ceremony were also huge for keeping everyone in harmony. The city's grand public spaces and sunken plazas were likely stages for rituals that brought people together under shared spiritual beliefs. And during these gatherings, the air was filled with music. We're talking flutes carved from condor bones and drums made from deer hides, creating soundscapes that echoed across the desert and tied everyone's lives to something much bigger than themselves. Leadership back then seemed to be less about military muscle and more about spiritual authority and just being really good at organizing things. Think about it. The city's leaders managed to coordinate massive construction projects, seasonal farming cycles, and complex trade deals, all without leaving behind any of the brutal scars of war. In an ancient world that we usually define by conflict, Carol is this amazing exception. It's a reminder that civilization doesn't have to be built on the backs of the conquered. It can actually be built through collaboration, creativity, and trust. At Carol, the stones still feel like they're humming with the echoes of a world long gone. This wasn't just a place for buildings and business. It was a city alive with sound and spiritual rhythm. Music and ritual were basically the heartbeat of the whole civilization. Archaeologists, digging carefully through the dry sand, uncovered a total treasure trove of ancient instruments. They found flutes made from condor and pelican bones, whistles fashioned from deer antlers, and small drums stretched with animal hides. These weren't just toys either. They were crafted with serious care and tuned to specific notes, designed to make sure the sound carried across the city's wide-open plazas. In a world without any written language, music became the language of the soul. Just imagine it, the low thrum of drums starting at dusk, flutes keening like the desert wind, and hundreds of people rhythmically stamping their feet on the sunken plazas as the light faded. Fires would crackle at the top of the pyramid platforms while priests in intricate woven robes chanted to the gods of the river, the earth, and the stars. In those moments, Carol wasn't just a city, it was a symphony. The layout of the city proves that ritual life was its literal core. Those grand plazas weren't just empty spaces, they were stages for massive ceremonies, specifically designed to pull people together. The sunken circular courts worked like ancient amphitheaters, focusing every sound and sight onto the rituals happening in the center. Above it all, the pyramids loomed, not as tombs, but as sacred man-made mountains linking the earth to the heavens. Music wasn't just for fun here. It was a bridge between people, nature, and the divine. You won't find any violent murals, terrifying war gods, or bloodthirsty sacrifices in Carol. Their spiritual world seemed to be all about harmony, celebration, and reverence. Even today, when the wind whistles through the ruins, you can almost hear the faint strains of that ancient music, the forgotten songs of a people who found beauty and connection in the middle of the harsh sands. But Carol was also a total engineering marvel. Without metal tools, wheels, or even pack animals, these people built a city of stone and earth that has lasted nearly 5,000 years. Their achievements are honestly mind-blowing. They didn't use small bricks, they used massive stones carried across the dry valley. Workers used shikras, ingenious reed bags woven from river plants, to haul heavy rocks. They also understood nature better than we might think. Carol sits in a major earthquake zone, yet the pyramids are still standing. How? They mastered earthquake-resistant architecture way back then. They used flexible construction techniques, layered fills, and rounded corners that allowed the monuments to absorb the seismic energy rather than just cracking. It was engineering born from a deep, intimate knowledge of the earth itself. And then there was their water management, another silent triumph. Even though they lived in a desert, the people of Carol were total pros at water management. They built sophisticated irrigation systems with channels and canals that guided river water exactly where it needed to go. This allowed their crops to thrive even when the dry season hit hard. They didn't waste a single drop. They knew every bit of water was precious. The layout of the city itself was a masterpiece of urban planning. All the major buildings were aligned with specific astronomical points, showing they had a deep grasp of solar cycles. Those Sunken plazas with their perfect geometry weren't just for hanging out. They were actually instruments for tracking the stars, helping priests and astronomers predict the seasons they needed for survival. The whole city was organized in a way that balanced daily life, administration, and sacred spaces perfectly. They weren't just building for themselves, they were building for the future. Today, modern engineers look at Carroll's resilience and realize that greatness isn't just about high-tech tools. Sometimes the real wisdom is in understanding the forces of nature and working with the land instead of fighting it. Carroll's stones have survived storms, earthquakes, and thousands of years of erosion. They're a silent reminder of a civilization that literally engineered its dreams into the sand. For centuries, Carroll was a beacon of peace, music, and trade. And then, almost without a trace, everyone just left. There were no fires, no signs of war, and no broken monuments suggesting a sudden disaster. Carroll just faded away. The plazas went empty, the pyramids were left to the sand, and the music stopped. The big question is, why did they leave? It's a mystery that still haunts the Soup Valley. Some experts think environmental changes dealt the final blow. There's evidence that a long, brutal drought might have totally crippled their farming. Without the river's life-giving water, the fields would have just withered away. The whole trade network, which relied on having extra cotton and food to swap, would have started to fall apart. That delicate balance Carroll had kept with such a harsh environment probably just tipped too far to be fixed. Some theories suggest the trade routes themselves shifted. As newer, more powerful centers popped up along the coast or further inland, Carroll might have lost its edge. Maybe the stuff they supplied, like cotton and produce, just wasn't enough to keep them at the top anymore. Slowly but surely, the city's economic lifeblood just drained away. Others wonder if things started breaking down from the inside. Since they didn't leave any written records, we can only guess about potential political drama, religious shifts, or just plain old exhaustion after hundreds of years of growth. Even the most peaceful societies can start to crack when surviving becomes a daily struggle. Whatever the reason was, it looks like people left gradually rather than all at once. Families probably drifted away one by one, looking for more fertile land, stronger rivers, and a fresh start somewhere else. The kids who used to play in Carroll's plazas grew up telling stories about a lost city they left behind, stories that eventually turned into legends, and then into silence. The desert eventually took back what the people had built. The wind carried fine sand over the stone temples, and those beautiful flutes ended up buried beneath the dunes. What was once a buzzing, vibrant civilization turned into a field of silent, sleeping mounds. For nearly 4,000 years, Carroll stayed hidden, just a whisper under the sand, waiting to be found. Even today, as archaeologists carefully brush away the dust from its stones, that one question still burns. How does a city so advanced and beautifully crafted just vanish? Maybe the truth is that even the greatest civilizations, no matter how wise or peaceful they are still fragile. They're like threads woven into the tapestry of time, always vulnerable to the unseen forces of change. For millennia, Carroll lay forgotten beneath the silent sands of the Soup Valley. Travelers would pass by these strange, rounded hills dotting the landscape, and never suspect that beneath their feet were ruins older than the pyramids of Egypt. To them, they were just natural mounds shaped by the wind. It wasn't until the late 20th century that the world finally heard Carroll's voice again. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the valley. She was driven by curiosity and a feeling that these hills were hiding secrets no one had uncovered yet. What they found would literally rewrite the story of human civilization in the Americas. Layer by painstaking layer, the sand was brushed away. Beneath it emerged walls of carefully cut stone, grand staircases, sunken plazas, and pyramids, a city far older than anyone could have imagined. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the unbelievable. Carroll was over 4,600 years old. It was thriving at the same time as the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. This discovery shook the foundations of archaeology. Before Carroll, scholars believed that civilization in the Americas developed much later, in the shadow of the great empires of the Old World. Carroll changed everything. It proved that the Americas had birthed monumental architecture, complex urban life, and social organization all on its own, long before the rise of the Incas or the Mayans. Ruth Shady and her team didn't just find stone and rubble, they found the actual heartbeat of a lost world. They uncovered musical instruments, fishing nets, textiles, and even quipus, those fascinating ancient knot records, along with offerings left for their gods. Every single artifact told the story of a people who built a society with real vision, intelligence, and a massive amount of creativity. The rediscovery of Carroll wasn't just a win for history books, it was a resurrection. A civilization that had slept under the desert for thousands of years was finally out in the open again. Its plazas are now kissed by the same winds that once carried the sound of flutes and the laughter of children. Today, Carroll is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's earliest dreams of building something together and belonging to something bigger. The sands hid Carroll well, but in the end, the stones were tougher. They waited for someone to finally listen, see, and remember. Carroll stands today as a silent giant, reminding us that the roots of civilization go way deeper than we used to think. Among those pyramids and plazas, the stones whisper a story that completely reshapes how we view humanity's journey. It's not a story about conquest and bloodshed, it's one of harmony, ingenuity, and hope. Long before the massive empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt took center stage, the people of Carroll were already doing something extraordinary. They raised pyramids without ever using a wheel. They mapped the stars without written records. They built a thriving society on a foundation of trade, music, ritual, and engineering, all without leaving a single scar of war on the land. In an era that we usually define by conflict and war, Carroll gives us a totally different vision of what civilization can actually be. It was a society that valued connection over conquest and knowledge over domination. It's a powerful reminder that becoming civilized doesn't have to mean becoming violent. Real greatness isn't measured by how many armies you have marching across a battlefield. It's measured by how a community comes together to build, create, and dream. Carroll's legacy reaches way beyond the dry sands of the Soup Valley. It challenges that old assumption that civilization had just one cradle or that city life and massive architecture started only in the Old World. Carroll proves that the human spirit of innovation popped up independently in many corners of the earth, shaped by different hands, but driven by the same eternal desire to endure, celebrate, and reach toward something divine. Today, when you walk through Carroll's weathered ruins, you can almost hear it, the pulse of the drums, the low hum of flutes, the murmur of traders bargaining in the plazas, and the laughter of kids racing through stone alleys under a sky full of endless stars. Their lives, their dreams, and their stories are still right here with us, etched into the very bones of the earth. Carroll teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their spirit can live on, sleeping under the sand, waiting to be remembered, and waiting to inspire us all over again. In the big timeline of human history, Carroll doesn't just shine as a relic of the past, it's a beacon for the future. It's a reminder that even in the harshest deserts and under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and build a world that reaches for the stars.